Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. My guest today is a mental health professional. She has been in the mental health industry for 15 years, and she works currently as an acute outpatient health provider. Her her experience dealing with younger people and the magnitude of the problem that we're seeing in mental health cannot be overstated. It's really one of those things that's just to some degree hiding in plain sight, and it leads to some of the worst tragedies we could imagine. I really enjoyed speaking with her and hearing about, again, her experience, and then really getting very clear tips and kind of guidance on how we can all start checking in with each other, young and the old, and try to make it through this together and in one piece. So without further ado, excuse me, the woman, the myth, the legend, Nardine Azab. I'm amazed that you had the time to actually get off of work to come talk to me. Thank you for coming in, Nardine.
Yes, thank you for having me.
How's it going in the mental health field these days?
Pretty rough, I have to say. I mean, it has always been a struggle, in recent years, but definitely past year or so, it's been pretty hectic.
Right. When you say recent years, what do you feel like our mental state, as far as younger people and families, has been getting more tumultuous in the past like 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, we know at least in the last 5 to 10 years, those numbers have been consistently on the rise, especially for teens. We know depression, anxiety, suicide attempts, and thoughts has been on the rise. That's the statistics, and we know that's already underreported for various reasons. But that's been the case. So it's not something new, and of course, the pandemic and what's been happening is definitely added to that.
What do you think the cause is for the increase in the last 10 years? I mean, that's obviously well outside of the bounds of this health crisis, pandemic, but what is it?
Yeah, I think there's probably a variety of reasons. Obviously, more people are reporting those symptoms than before. Maybe 20, 30 years, not a lot of people talked about mental health. So we're trying to catch that more. We're asking some of those questions, like in the doctor's office, in schools, things like that. So we're trying to capture some of that. So that's part of it. But there's been a lot of stress, demand, especially for teens, things becoming really competitive. We know social media screen time has definitely played a role, increasing that. And again, these are not, cause and effect per se, but, a correlation that involves a number of factors.
Is competition itself something that breeds depression and discontent? And I don't mean to dismiss it, right? I mean, I think we all know that the world is competitive, especially for teens. Things have become more competitive, right? So it's harder to get into, let's say, UC Berkeley than it
Sure.
was 30 or 40 years ago, or Michigan, or University of Washington. But is the difficulty of getting into UC Berkeley really the thing that causes people to be upset, or is it the comparison and the presumed failings of the individual? It's like, well, everyone else is getting in, or everybody else is doing this, instead of just saying, oh, it's really hard to get into UC Berkeley, and then getting upset about that. It's kind of like, I don't feel like the competition itself is necessarily at the heart of the crisis.
Probably not. I think it's, maybe has to do more with just the unrealistic expectations that we've set, for our kids, for teens, that you kind of have to be the best at everything, which is just not realistic. I mean, when you think about, a normal bell curve, most of us kind of fall in the middle, right? That's just
Hence the
life.
bell curve.
Right. Just a few kind of are on the outliers. So, some of it is unrealistic expectations. Some of it is the way we've defined what it means to be successful, right? Like a certain checklist that you have to go through, and we've not paid attention to other factors that, could lead to happiness or people feeling successful.
You know what's so interesting about the way you're saying that, defining success? There's so many people in this community who took atypical paths to success, right? That one of my first guests, my very good friend Jeff Hubbins, the reason I wanted to interview him is because he's a very successful attorney. He has his little firm in Walnut Creek, and does class action lawsuits, employment law, all of these things. His path to that was so roundabout. At one point, he was throwing bags of salt in like a Morton salt factory. Like he did all of these things. He went to a JC before he went to undergrad. All of these things. Yet people would look at him and say, "Here's Jeff. I'm 17 and I would like to be Jeff. And there's only one path to be Jeff." Right? I have to go straight to undergrad. I have to go straight to law school. I have to go straight to all these things. And it's kind of like I would feel that in a community that has such a diverse history of successful paths, we would be telling our youth more, look, there's not just one way. Like, calm down. This isn't the way. But that's not what's happening. It's like people double down on, the bumper stickers and, USC and parent of blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. And, when I work with teens, I always say, like, if you want to get somewhere, there's more than one way to get there, right? But somehow, like you're saying, we've kind of just defined that path, and everyone has to go through that path, even though you may not fit into that for whatever reason. Maybe that's not your talent, where you want to go, how your life is going to work. But we sort of kind of just pushed everybody to walk the same, direction, same, requirements, everything, steps. Whereas, yes, there is multiple ways to get there. It's really become like more of a rigid way of thinking, so that when you're not able to do that, you can't tolerate that stress, right? Because you're not getting what you want, but you're not really looking at being creative and flexible, how you get there.
Right. One thing actually that I've been very worried about in this last year, lots of things that I'm worried about. One of the larger things for California students, because again, I do all test prep. So with the UC system eliminating the SAT, there are a lot of problems with this. But one that I don't think I've talked about publicly is the anxiety that's going to be thrust upon an 8th grader going into freshman year it's going to skyrocket. Because when I was going to high school up until recently, it's kind of like, all right, look, freshman year grades are not, they're not the end all be all. Okay. And even when you had a student that was, say, not crushing it as much in freshman and sophomore year, their parents and likely the student knew, especially if you're dealing with a bright student, it's kind of like, okay, well, look, maybe your GPA is not going to be the best, and maybe you got a lot of sports going on and some other things, but you're going to have to crush these standardized tests to really show ability. And people would do that. People would do that very, very frequently. I did that, right? I had a lot going on, and I didn't have a lot of consistent family support through my high school years, but I was capable and bright. So my GPA wasn't fantastic, but I crushed the standardized test. If we take away that second means of admission, which is, hey, you have your GPA, and if you can't get your GPA together for the first 2 or 3 years, you still have this test, so you have those 2 different routes. If we take away that, all of a sudden at 14, you better be getting a 4.0. It better be perfect. And there's no redemption. There's no path to redemption, which causes anxiety at an earlier age.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to a larger issue that, have been constantly pushing teens to kind of sort of figure everything out at an earlier and earlier age. Right at 14, you probably just cognitively, developmentally are not there to figure out all of these pieces, right? What you want to do 20 years from now or where you want to see yourself. Yet we're asking them to make all of these decisions, so to speak, and that pressure. And somehow if you don't know those answers, like there's something wrong and you have to hurry up and figure it out,
right?
Which creates a lot of stress, anxiety.
Here's the thing, though. It creates stress and anxiety for who? Like, the 14-year-old has not lived life to the point where they know, hey, in my previous life, I didn't know what I wanted to do at 14 and 15 and 16, and that was a problem, right? The 14 and 15 and 16-year-old have never been there before. So it's almost like we keep saying, gosh, our kids are so stressed, but we're neglecting the fact that they're only stressed because we are, as a community, telling them to be stressed. Like if we as a community told every 14, 15, and 16-year-old, hey, look, you don't have to know what you want to do right now. Just be cool with it. Like do your best, learn as much as you can because that will affect you later. But like you don't have to know right now. If we as a community told people that, then the 14 and 15 and 16-year-old would not be freaked out the same way. What I'm getting at is I feel that parents put so much of the ownness of the result, right? Like they see the symptom, the kids are getting stressed. But what they're not addressing is that 9 times out of 10, when I meet a student that's really wigged out, it's coming from the parents. And the parents keep looking at the kid and saying, gosh, you're so stressed out. I should, get you a therapist, or I should get you this, or I should get you that. And they're not looking at themselves asking, how are we collectively contributing to this? Because it's like, it's us as a community.
Right, and I think a lot of the times that's the case. I know myself as a parent, I'm guilty of that at times, right? When you see those assignments that haven't been turned in and you start to get worked up, because it's easy to get sucked into this whole mentality, right? Of like, you need to figure things out, you need to be on top of things, you need to ace everything, which again is not a realistic expectation because not everyone's going to be perfect at everything. Yet that's what we're asking a lot of teens.
Right. That's the standard that we're trying to hold them to.
I mean, on top of every other stressor. I mean, yes, school is a big part for teens and kids, but there's a lot of other things going on, especially right now where, you've got the pandemic and, school being out and with teens, social media has been in the mix for a number of years. So that's one part of the equation. So when you look at the big picture, there's a lot of stressors. So it's no wonder, right, we're seeing those numbers consistently rise year over year.
Right. And I mean, this year is horrendous. One, you mentioned social media. One of the things that I've been chatting with people about is that nobody thinks social media is a good thing. Right, like it's kind of like sugar. Is anybody out there running around like, oh, sugar's great for you? Besides, like Mars bar or something.
I mean, you'll find people, and I would say I would have to agree with some of that. When we've, as adults, taken, the stance of all social media is bad all the time, teens usually tend to tune us out. Like you're just living in a different world, and they're kind of, accurate in that because we didn't grow up with that. But for many teens, that's their life, right? That's what they've grown up with. So there's some ways that you can frame that in a positive way so you're not completely tuned out by teens. But I would say there's a lot of problematic issues that people are not really paying attention to.
Like what? What are the biggest things that you see from a teen standpoint coming out of it?
I think this kind of, closed loop of what you're receiving and just kind of on repeat, and then after a while it becomes all you think about and you think that's the world. It's kind of a distorted view, right? If what you're seeing is just what people are posting, that's not the entire reality, right, of people's lives or what's happening around you, and you sort of become really wrapped up around this. And of course, if some of this content is negative, which a lot of it can be, then you're kind of trapped. And it's really hard to break away from that and see, oh, this is just like what I'm seeing behind the screen versus what reality is like.
I was speaking with a student last week, a couple students. I go to San Ramon, and one of the students was saying that although adults frequently say like, hey, this isn't reality, you need to get away from it. This particular girl was saying, yes, I understand that, but the things that happen in this non-reality, right, the things that happen in the cyber world on social media or whatever, those do translate into the real world. So for a lot of people, I think a lot of teens, because, I chat with my students all the time and I give them a hard time about, Snapchat or whatever. And so we get into these conversations, and I think a lot of teens would be very fast to say, look, I understand that this is not the end-all be-all. That's fine. But you need to understand that even if I lost my phone tomorrow and never got it again, that doesn't mean my real life would not be affected from social media. So to some degree, it's kind of like we're weaving the two so intensely together that to untangle them is going to be impossible.
Right, and I don't think it's a very, straight divide like that we can make. So I can agree with those students. But I think the tricky part is when they become so entangled, you tend to have a more difficult time, kind of looking at the pieces separately, right? It all kind of becomes just mixed up. And you have a hard time understanding, what's realistic, what's not, right? What's healthy, what's not. And kind of, taking these pieces apart becomes really hard.
Right. There's another, in my opinion, not saying I'm an expert, but there's another style of communication and language that's developing around non-language based things. Okay, so for instance, pictures on Instagram. This is one of my favorite hacks that it's like every teenage girl I've ever spoken with is like, yeah, that happens. So what girls do, some girls, not all girls, is they will have a friend, okay, and they'll take pictures with the friend throughout the year, whenever they're at the beach, they're doing social things. It doesn't matter. They're, at home. Anyway, so they take pictures with a friend and they save these pictures. Now, I've been silly sometimes in saying that they have like files of different girls and pictures, and some girls actually agree. But let's just say they have these pictures on the phone. Then a birthday rolls around. Okay, so now this girl's friend is turning, 16 or 17, whatever. And the person will go to the Instagram page or the Snapchat or whatever story they're on, and they'll post pictures of the two girls together. The birthday girl almost always looking terrible, and the person posting looking beautiful, like fantastic. Like the other girl was mid-sneeze or like just some ridiculous. And then the girl that's posting it obviously looks beautiful and she's smiling and all these things. And I say that's a non-communication based language because it's clear that people are manipulating you, right? If somebody does that, they don't have to say anything. You're like, oh, you're doing this or you're saying that. And there's this nuance that develops with, posting pictures or not posting pictures. And there are social pressures that start building around these different, like, how fast did you respond? How fast did you not respond? All of these things. And I feel like that's one thing that students are building. It's almost like it's developing and they're navigating it at the same time. And that's a world of communication that's separated from adults that are trying to help them. And that's when you get a lot of people being upset, younger people being upset. They might be crying or they might be really frustrated and they're trying to explain it to adults. I've had this several times where somebody's like, you don't understand. This is what this is doing. This is what this means. I'm like, I'm not following. Like, I'm not trying to ignore you. I just don't get it. Do you find yourself trying to bridge the gap within families with young people trying to express these kinds of things? Like, you don't understand the nuances of the world I'm living in that causes obviously turmoil within the family unit.
Right. And again, because a lot of us as parents did not grow up with this, right? And even the type of technology that we use right now is still, we use it in a different way for, most part. So for teens, that's the reality, and that's what's happening in all of these different, facets of communication or whatnot that we may not be getting. And when you just kind of automatically jump in and say, well, that doesn't mean that, or, you're overreacting or whatnot, you're invalidating, right, that experience instead of trying to understand what it means and then trying to work with problem solving.
How do you disentangle the fact that teens in general, both male and female, are just flat out more impulsive and more emotional? How do you untangle the problem with the fact that that's a reality of, hormones and just your growth spurt, right? Like, you're changing, right, in that age, and adults maybe also not knowing what they're going through with the tech. That's like a two-front war.
Yeah, and that's why I think the work becomes very complex, because we're trying to work on both ends. the parents working on their piece and the teens working on their piece, building those skills. I mean, a lot of times when you look at this problem, you're thinking what the teens don't have or what they're lacking, right? They're not able to think that way, or they're impulsive or whatnot, right? Versus they're in a process of developing those skills, right? Like, at 15, you don't have all of these skills in place, but you're learning, and some of it is trial and error, some of it is life experience. So instead of looking at it as like a deficit, what you're not able to do or what you're not getting right now, you're in a learning process until you get some of these skills.
Gosh, man, what a rough way to learn, though. What a rough way to learn, where everything is saved forever.
Right. And again, that's part of the stress, right? When you think about you and I growing up, you didn't have to worry about that. I mean, you're just worried about what happens in the moment with people, or like people talking, about you behind your back, but that's it. Like, there's nothing else to worry about, versus all of these, different factors that you have to take in place that create real problems. I mean, we'll see a lot of the cyberbullying and a lot of these negative interactions that contribute to suicide attempts and completed suicide.
God, man, that's terrible. Do you feel like the cyberbullying is really just in the realm of teens? Because more and more, I'm seeing the things that I would presume you would warn your younger people away from engaging in. You would say, like, look, this is toxic. I feel like more and more that's becoming the norm for adults. And that will just trickle down into our younger people and all over our community.
And it can be, but I think the difference is, for most adults at least, you hopefully have some tools in place where you can deal with that, right? Like, you're hopefully more mature, you have life experience, you have people to talk to, your brain is even more developed, right? That's a skill that's going to help you. But for a lot of teens and even children, so because it's not just teens, we're seeing this for, much younger kids, they don't have a lot of these tools in place. So they're coming from a place of deficit, trying to, manage all of these problems without having a lot of tools in place.
But yes, 100% yes. But cancel culture is different for like a 15-year-old. Right? Like, in the worst case scenario, you'd get somebody, like expelled for saying something horrifically racist or something like that. But that's a very, very rare event. For adults, the cancel culture is substantially greater and more impactful. You can lose your job very easily. You can get passed up on a promotion. You can lose friends instantaneously, your support groups, things like that. I feel like there's just so much more to lose, and it actually is really impactful. For instance, I spoke with a woman, a couple women months ago, about just going back to school. And they're very much in favor of it. And afterwards, a week or two after the interview, and everything was fine, nobody cared about the interview, we just spoke. A week or two later, some people were very displeased with one of the guests for a myriad of reasons. And they came after me to take down the episode I did with her. I had nothing to do with the thing they were upset at her about. They came after her. They started posting all these horrific things, like giving me terrible reviews, not horrific, but just terrible reviews, saying all these bad things about me. And it shocked me, because it's kind of like, the reviews you're posting, they don't go away.
Right.
Right? Like, the things and again, I'm not doing this, I'm not getting paid to do this, so I'm not worried about my business, right? Well, at least not that much, but there are consequences for adults that are, although they do have coping mechanisms, right? Like, this woman was very tough and understood how to think through the problem and take a step back and say, okay, let's take stock of what's really important, what's happening, and get through it. And she did. And that's great. But the consequences were very real. Like, the risk to her was far greater than the average person the average teen, because the teen is not going to lose their job and their house and their, all of their friends and all of these things. So again, in that way, I feel like the risk for adults is actually much more substantial, which puts more power in the hands of adults that are like trolling around the internet.
I mean, and theoretically speaking, yes, but that doesn't always happen because, part of the fact with being behind a screen is, you know, almost like unconsciously, right? It creates this distance where you don't think your words or actions or whatever have the same effect as it would in person. Majority of people will not say half the things they say if they were sitting, with someone face to face, even if it was a stranger, right? Again, majority of people, not everyone. But you sort of like check yourself when you're in person talking to someone or, right in their face versus like I can just type away and it seems to be kind of going into a vacuum versus like a real person.
Right. Well, obviously, the number one thing is plain as day. If I said something rude on the internet, I hit enter, I put away my phone, I check it 30 seconds later to see if anybody's responded, put it away, 30 seconds later, I check. If you say something rude in person and the person just stares at you and there's dead silence for like 5 seconds, you are taken aback instantly.
Right.
You're shocked. You're like, oh, that didn't come out the way I meant it, or something like that, right? So you have obviously tons and tons of pieces of real life feedback. But it's just, I feel, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because you're saying it doesn't always play out this way, but it seems to me that the adults in general have focused so much on warning off, warning young people about the ails of social media, that they themselves think that they're somehow immune to these things. And that to me is a real problem because one, they start doing the things that they don't want the teens to do and the teens replicate. And you can see that in any of the social media campaigns that teenagers are putting together right now, telling people to go die and all this. It's like, oh my God, you can't say that stuff. But perhaps I'm wrong. I mean, what has your experience been with that? Do you feel that adults are falling into these pitfalls?
Sure. I think because it could be a little bit different that sometimes adults will have this disconnect, like I'm not doing that specifically like teens are doing, so it must be different. But it's really the same concept. It just may look different, depending on which like app you're using or, modality or whatnot.
Facebook versus Instagram.
Right, exactly. So, it may seem like, oh, no, I'm not doing that. But, kind of the underlying issue is the same.
Right. So when dealing with teens, specifically, let's start with them, teens and younger people. Although I have to assume the number of really young people you have been working with has got to have increased over the last year.
Absolutely. I mean, we're definitely seeing a lot of trends, and I don't think that information is out there or really paid attention to much, except in maybe like vague, terms or statements. But we've definitely seen an increase in people seeking services. We've seen, an increase in acuity level. So instead of people coming in with just like mild to moderate, type of symptoms, they're, moderate to severe.
What types of symptoms would you be talking about? Like,
so we're talking about, things like anxiety, depression, suicide attempts, so it's not just like I'm feeling a little stress kind of thing. I could use, talking to someone. It's becoming more of an impairment, with your day-to-day functioning. So the level of intensity or acuity that we're seeing is definitely gone up. It's higher. We're seeing younger folks come in, elementary age students come in with those kinds of symptoms. We're seeing people who are kind of like what we call brand new to mental health, like they don't have, history of struggling with depression or kind of been in and out of treatment, that type of stuff. They're really brand new, and their first touchdown, that system is a suicide attempt, or, in the ER waiting to be placed in an inpatient facility.
So you have, again, people that they don't have a history of mental health issues. They don't have a history of, drugs or alcohol or anything. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they show up at the ER.
Absolutely.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, and I think that's the really concerning piece. Because for someone who's maybe been struggling with depression for, a number of years or whatnot, you maybe have some resources in place. You kind of know your warning signs, whatnot. But to come out of nowhere and to land, in that kind of intense place is really scary.
Really scary. What do you do when you're dealing with elementary school kids? I mean, you're dealing with like a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old or even younger. How do you start to unravel that for them?
Yeah, and
Like they can't even make their own lunch.
right, and I've definitely talked to people in the last year, who are 9, 10, thinking about not wanting to be alive, which again speak about how scary and sad that is when you're 9 or 10. I think because they're so young, a lot of parents miss that or see some of the warning signs, but don't think it will be that bad. Like they can't possibly be thinking about that. They're only 9 or 10. So people kind of shy away from those conversations and, wait until things get to be really bad.
Gosh, man. Well, how do you even bring that up with your 4th grader? You're like, hey, what do you...
Yeah.
I mean, like, what I'm saying is, you're saying you have this influx of younger people. It's more severe. And that's terrifying. And one of my very good friends came in recently and chatted about his, I think she was 7 at the time, telling him that. She's like, Dad, I don't want to live anymore. This is really bad. And he did bring up a good point. He was like, look, thankfully she's only 7, so her capacity to fall through with these things and it's not really there, and he has gotten her help, and he did get her into school, and she feels so much better. She's just like night and day. She was up 2 hours early, totally dressed, ready to go on the first day. But for the parent who is just thinking about trying to check in with their kid, because this is a horrific kind of thing to imagine that you have a young person with no history of depression or mental health, and here's the problem: everybody's unhappy right now.
Yes.
Like that's undeniable. So it's kind of like, you want to check in with your kid if they're unhappy. It's like, of course they're unhappy.
Sure.
Nobody's happy. So let's just focus on the youngest group. If you are wanting to check in with your elementary kid, it can't just start with, well, is your kid happy or not? Because nobody's happy. So how do you check in with them? Like, how do you start identifying this?
Yeah, I think before you start to check in, you have to be aware of some of the warning signs and paying attention to that. I think because things have been so difficult for everyone last year, we kind of just assume the default, everyone's struggling, which is true, right? But
Which is totally true.
Yeah, but we're struggling to different degrees, right?
Yeah, right. Someone
maybe just feeling, somewhat stressed, but they're able to cope, and other people are struggling or they don't want to be alive. That's a different kind of struggle. So, moving away from, I know things are hard for them, but kind of thing, and really trying to unpack or understand, what does that mean? Things are hard for them. Like, what are you seeing? Like, are you seeing them become more frustrated easily? More irritable, they're really having trouble sleeping, or they're eating more or less than usual. They've kind of maybe lost interest in some of the things they used to enjoy. And again, the tricky piece is there's a lot of limitations now, right? So it's hard to know if they've given up on soccer or just because they can't play, right? But you can pick up other pieces, right? Like if they do art at home or whatnot, have they just stopped doing some of that? And it's not like they picked something else. They just are not doing any of those things. So if you're seeing some of those warning signs and they're, more consistent, it's just not like a one-off, bad day, you really need to start asking those questions. And for younger kids, you're going to have to find some of the words and language, because they're not going to be able to articulate, very well how they're feeling.
Right. So what are, aside from art, because I just realized that would actually be a great bellwether. I mean, to figure out if somebody really enjoys making art and then they've just completely lost interest. Or do you ever use it as a way for them to communicate without using words? Like, let's all sit down and draw a picture together. And then you see the kids drawing like a funeral or something dark, and you're like, oh.
Yeah, and I mean, art definitely is a great tool. We use it in therapy a lot, but not every kid will use that as an outlet. But you can definitely pick up on that if especially if they're into art or drawing. But you need to ask them, more directly, and again, using their language. So it might be, kind of a rating scale of 1 to 10, or it could be colors, right? How are you feeling today?
My
orange,
God, just don't
red.
say purple.
Right. I mean, you obviously have to define what the
Yeah,
what the
right.
colors mean, right? Green, orange, red. If they're
Yeah.
constantly in the red, and that's you've identified that as not good, then you need to start asking them, like, what are some things that make you stressed? Do you feel happy? Are you able to enjoy the things that you do? And sometimes you have to ask, those difficult questions. Do you ever think about not being around or not being alive? And I know that's a really difficult conversation for parents to have with younger kids or even teens. Like almost, always, parents want to move away from asking those questions because you don't want to hear it, obviously.
Oh
but
my
also,
gosh, it's
if you hear it,
true.
you don't want to think about what do I do, and then the fear kicks in. But not asking the questions doesn't make it go away. It probably makes it worse.
Yeah, there's this really odd thing that I've seen develop, and I've noticed it over the years, and I've kind of started putting my finger on it, where parents really want their kids to lie to them effectively. Like, and it's not even like a malicious thing, right?
Right.
Parents, like a good friend of mine last night, she was like, talking about her kid. She said, "Look, I don't want to know about it. You guys better not get caught." Right. And it wasn't even that overt. It was, she had a different way of saying it. But essentially saying, look, I don't want to know about it. And what she's essentially saying is just cover it all up. Do whatever you want. Right. Or so you see somebody after a Saturday night, Sunday morning. How was last night? Oh, it was fine. Oh, it was okay. You're like, what do you mean? What are you acting so weird about? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh gosh, what did you do last night? And you get parents that I think start that at an early age, which is kind of, I know I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus, but I think, like you're saying, like they're afraid to know the answer. You're afraid to know what your 17-year-old did last night, so you just don't ask, or you don't want them to get caught doing it. But I think that starts at a very young age. Like you're saying, they may not want to check in with a third or fourth grader because they're afraid of the answer.
Right. Yeah, and again, being afraid or not wanting to know doesn't make the problem go away. More often than not, it makes it worse. Because if you ask the questions and you hear the answer, it really means you have to do something about it. So if we don't want to do something about it, we don't ask those questions. And a lot of times it's also kind of subtle, the way, just dynamics work in the family. And teens and kids are very smart. They'll pick up on, if I kind of throw this little piece out, for you, this piece of information, I'll see how you react. And they're not, again, doing this in kind of a malicious way. It's just a way for them to
Control
know
the world.
and see what's safe, right? So if I tell you this little piece of information and you freak out or you ignore it or whatever, then I know it's not safe to, share those bigger problems.
Right. There was this really funny episode of Modern Family a couple years ago where Cam, the giant guy from the South, and I can't remember what the wife's name is, Claire. So Cam and Claire are doing a remodel on a house, and they have both found ways to get the other person to just give up inquiring because they were both going like way over budget. So Claire's thing was that she would throw out like a spreadsheet full of numbers at Cam until he was just like, okay, stop, do whatever. She's like, and then we're going to do this, but like all these numbers. And his way of doing it was to, like piggyback some. He was like, oh, I'm just going to have a guy come over and look at the backyard. And she's like, oh, okay. And then it turned out it was like a guy making a fountain with like fish jumping. Right. It was like, so they all figured out ways to just get the other person to give up asking so they could move on with whatever it is. And I see that happening so much. People just kind of want a reason to give up inquiring. Like you're saying, I can give you this little piece of information and you'll lose interest. Right? And move on. And to some degree, the person just wants to move on. They want to feel like everything's okay. But that doesn't mean it is, in fact, okay. Right. But to stop that, you have to become very aware of the things that cause you to lose interest and just walk away, because it's entirely possible you're just getting played. Right? It's kind of like...
Yeah, and again, you don't even have to try hard to make this happen, because these conversations are already difficult to have. Right. So any kind of resistance, that you'll get, it's just easier to walk away from those conversations. But again, because things are worsening for a lot of teens and young children, that's more reason to be asking those questions and looking for those warning signs and getting help when you feel like, I don't know what to do, which is okay.
If the kind of simple stuff for the younger people is like, hey, look, how are you eating? Are you engaging in the activities that you generally engage in? Those seem to be simple warning signs. What are the bigger warning signs for teens? Because teens have become increasingly recluse, right? So they hide in their rooms and they're like, hey, I'm doing distance learning. But you don't actually know what's going on in the room. Like with a first grader, my first grader comes out and he sits at the island in our kitchen where we always are. We're always cooking. So he sits at the island so we can watch him, we can engage him, we can keep him in the fold of the family. But for older people, for the teens, they disappear by design, at least to some part, into these closed off spaces, and you can no longer observe them. You don't know necessarily how much they're eating. You don't know how they're engaging in things, and to some degree when they get 15, 16, 17, you're hoping they're functioning to some degree autonomously. And that autonomous function, that detaching, can lead to you missing all kinds of things that are going on with them. So how do you tell people to look out for the warning signs when by design you're not even around your teen anymore?
Yeah, and I mean, these things were already a challenge before distance learning for a lot of teens, being on screens, being alone in their rooms, all of these things, not getting enough sleep. These were already challenges that we're having to deal with working with teens and families. And now add to it, what's happening right now, it almost feels like, well, there's nothing I can do, right? Like they need to do this, or, they have to be in the room all day. And, I've seen a lot of parents and families sort of just kind of given up on a lot of the common sense stuff, which initially, made sense, right? We were like lockdown. There's really nothing that you can do other than, maybe being on a screen, talking to friends or whatnot. Right. But there are some options now. But, I've seen, because of the demands that are happening right now, parents have kind of just really not even loosened up, like are not even holding some of those boundaries. If you have to be on a screen for 6 hours, doing schoolwork, and that's out of your control, you can at least control, where you do that. Or once you're done with that, what else you're going to do, or take a break, or, having some sort of a daily routine. So everything has just sort of fallen apart. And this really just makes the problem worse for a lot of families and teens.
Right. So what are some of the ways that you can re-engage teens? Because as you were saying, in the beginning, we're all kind of like, hey, this is crazy, but it's only going to be 2 weeks.
Right.
So, in the beginning, nobody was prepared, okay, for mental health, physical health, anything. Right. But at this point, and I say at this point, we really need to have a game plan, because there's no end in sight for a lot of people. Obviously teenagers will likely be the last ones to go back to public school. And, whether that happens in 2021 is a giant question at all, right? So we're going to have to adapt, right? We're going to have to figure out ways over the next 12 to 18 months to get our teens through this safely. And families, obviously families are just ill-equipped to iron this out. I mean, if you're lucky enough to have a steady job, you're likely really focused
Right.
on that, really working. I know one of the big problems I have is just trying to do any work at home is impossible with my little kids running around. It's just my anxiety skyrockets. I'm trying to text somebody about scheduling for a review class, and it's like all hell breaks loose.
Yeah.
So what are things moving forward that you think families could do? Say I'm a concerned dad and I have a 16-year-old, and I'm like, gosh, I don't know how to check in. I don't, obviously nobody's happy. I don't know the degree to which my son or my daughter is unhappy. What do you tell me? Like, if I come to him like, look, I need a game plan for 12 months to make sure I can avoid these things. I want to come out of this as strong as possible and as safe as possible. What do you throw out to me?
Yeah, and some of these things are just common sense things, but they are an area of struggle because teens will push back on that, and that's just what they do. I know I struggle with that with my own kids and having to kind of repeatedly say the same thing over and over. But if you as a parent kind of recognize the risk and the urgency, hopefully that will encourage you to really follow through on some of these things and not see them as, oh, well, what can I do kind of, thing. We'll just kind of write this thing and see where we go, because that will likely not land in a very good place. So basic things, eating and sleeping, we know that is crucial for just, your well-being, for mental health. Even though teens are getting a little bit more sleep, which is a good thing because they don't have to get up as early, they're not doing as many things. The sleep schedule can become really all over the place.
Right.
Because it also feels like I don't really have to get up and go anywhere, so I can just do whatever.
Right. People are still in their pajamas on Zoom. You don't have to turn on your camera. So I've had students that say they stay up till 3, 4 a.m. And then they kind of like a slug, get out of bed, hit their Zoom, and all of a sudden they're, quote, in school. And they've taken attendance or whatever,
Yes.
And for whatever reason they say, I can't turn on my camera. And it's very hard to fight with a 16-year-old when they're like, I can't turn it on, right? So that sleep schedule, that seems to be a huge one for people of all ages.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, even though your day may look different now, like you still need to get enough sleep as a teen or as a kid to function well and to feel okay. Otherwise, you start feeling more irritable, more tired, unmotivated, and you become, kind of more just relax at home, and you're not, having a lot of energy. So there's a ripple effect for something as basic as sleep. Same with, you mentioned getting dressed. I mean, just basic hygiene, believe it or not. I work with teens who, haven't changed their outfits in like 4 days, which I know happens for a lot of teens, but it's like, you can't feel really good about yourself and your day if you're kind of in PJs for 4 days straight and maybe even haven't showered.
Right.
Because, well, I don't have to be anywhere. But if you make that an expectation at home, like you get up in the morning, you prepare for your day as if you're going to school, right? You get dressed, you get, breakfast, you kind of have a defined start to your day and a defined end versus things that are just like all mixed up where it doesn't feel as productive. It can't be good for your mental health. So again, basic things, eating, sleeping, the isolation piece is huge. And again, part of it, they're doing, schoolwork for a number of hours, but you can take breaks. You can do schoolwork, somewhere that's not in your room. You can and should have your door open, where it feels like you're connected to the rest of your home. I have teens who are like in their rooms for days with doors closed. They're like, do you even know what's happening outside your room? Like,
God, that's so dark. Imagine a human being shut away in a room on electronics for days. Like, that's just that's not what we're supposed to be doing. That's not going to breed the best mental state.
No. And again, so if you start to take some of those things away and say, no, there's some expectations, like you have to take a screen break, you have to do activities that do not involve, screens, or you have to be outside doing something. I know that's a huge struggle for
Go
some
into the
teens.
backyard and play. Dad, I'm 18.
Right.
Into the backyard. Here's a truck.
Right. But I mean, even with that, I mean, you say it jokingly, but when the weather is okay, like go read a book in the backyard versus in your bed. That will create some, positive effect for your mood. Or just go take a walk or, bike ride or whatever. Like there are still things that you can do safely. So I encourage parents to, be doing those basic things and still limiting screen time. I know that seems really challenging right now, but it can still be done.
Do you ever advocate taking away electronics for a portion of your day? Because this is something I was talking about with a student years ago, that he would say, I think it was every 7th day he took away his phone from himself. And he was kind of like, look, I'm not on it. I don't look at it. And the next day, it's like a train wreck, right? It's like all this stuff has happened. But it allowed him to kind of connect with the physical world again. Have you ever advocated something like, look, at 8 o'clock, the internet goes down in the house, or, we all put our phones away and we, like play Scrabble or something. I mean, whatever activity you want to get up to, that's up to you. But you don't have the option to look at a screen because the screens are so damn compelling, right? Like everything. One thing that I actually heard people advocate for is if you're worried about it, you personally, you can flip your screen to a grayscale, and that takes away some of the allure of staring at it. You're like, it's just this gray blob. It's just not as appealing. So again, do you ever advocate for something like that?
Absolutely. I mean, I always, when I work with parents, encourage them to have, kind of a shut-off time at the end of the day and really not have screens in your room overnight. There's no reason to have that while you're sleeping unless you're not sleeping, right? And, a lot of times they'll say, well, I need it for my alarm. Like there's old-fashioned alarms out there if you really must use an alarm. But, I mean, if you get into those habits, chances are as an adult you'll have those habits in place. And again, it depends on what age we're talking about, right? As, teens approach, 16, 17, they're approaching 18, they're going to be on their own, right, sooner rather than later. So you don't want it to be just kind of like, I'm making these rules for you. This is why it's good for you. I'm encouraging you to do it, kind of like the teen you talked about, making up that rule for himself, because you want them to take responsibility for that later on versus you having to do it for them.
What if they just don't want to? Right? Like that's one of the things that I was joking with a student the other day about the depth of psychology. I said, look, let's say Jack keeps his room clean, right, as an adult or as somebody in college. People say, why do you keep your room clean? And he says, well, my mom always made me clean my room, so I clean my room. Fine. Jack has a brother, Alex. Alex's room is a complete mess. Okay, and they say, Alex, why is your room a complete mess? It's like, well, my mom was always on me about keeping my room clean, so now I just don't care. Like, you can see it both ways. And I see the whole, hey, I'm going to lay the foundation for you so you get the benefit and you do it later. It's one of those things where it's kind of like, oh, man. Yes, later in life, I stopped myself being on my phone because my mom always made me take breaks. Yeah, that's all well and fine, but what about the person who's like, gosh, it's so annoying when my mom does this?
Yes, and I think, naturally you'll see some of this pushback. I haven't worked with any teens who are like, yes, sign me up, to limit my screen time use. But you'll see varying degrees of resistance, right? And you might want to start small. If you didn't have any kind of rules at all around screen time and all of a sudden you want to implement like 50 rules that seem, unattainable, that might not be, very successful. But maybe start small and build on that. And as a parent, I work with a lot of parents who are like, well, I don't know if I can do that. I'm like, well, yes, you can. You're the parent. You should be able to do those things. But at the same time, yes, teens, will do what they want to do at the end of the day. But that should not be an excuse for you as a parent to not be having some boundaries or rules in place. I mean, you at least need to do your part.
Isn't the boundary and rule in place almost identical to asking how the kid's doing? Because I always find it's kind of like, look, we can set boundaries, we can set rules, but that means we're going to either have to enforce them, which you don't always want to do. Because at the end of the day, you're like, I can't keep fighting this fight, right? You either have to enforce them, or you have to acknowledge that your rules and boundaries are not meant to be followed anyway, because you're not going to enforce them. So then, because you're like, well, I can't set a rule and then not enforce the rule because I don't want to be, this apathetic blob, but I also don't want to enforce this rule because I'm too tired, you just give up. You're like, well, I'm just not going to make any rules because I don't have the bandwidth to enforce them, and I just can't care right now.
Yes, so I mean, a couple of things that if you're in that place, then maybe pick, rules or things that are really important to you, that you care about, that you want to follow through on. And if other things are not a big deal in your home, maybe don't, worry too much about that. But at the same time, if you're just because you're tired or don't want to put in the effort, I mean, doesn't mean it's okay to not do it, because it then creates a lot of chaos, for teens and definitely for younger kids. When we don't have any kind of boundaries, we have a hard time then figuring out how to self-regulate.
Right.
And that's not a good skill.
Right. That's just, oh gosh, getting my kids to follow through with any kind of boundaries. It's like, it's just, I'm getting anxiety. My anxiety acuteness is going up.
Right. But again, thinking about like if having some of those boundaries and rules in place, even if they're not perfect, they're not followed all the time, helps them, learn to self-regulate, right? Manage themselves, work on, delaying gratification, all of these skills that are so important, growing up and to have as adults. If you're not doing those things, then you're not teaching them those skills.
How do you deal with obsessive compulsive behavior around phones and teens? Because this is one of those things that I think is like, people just need their phone. There was some stat I was heard about that the majority of people have their phone. They can reach their phone without moving like 80% of the day, and they use it liberally, and it becomes this compulsive thing. I find myself doing it at times with, well, I'm not really on social media, but I find myself doing it with other things. Like I'll check to see if a student or parent has text messaged me, or if an email came in. It's like the slot machine. You're like, oh, what is it? What is it? And I see this of myself. I see these behaviors. I'm like, oh, that's gross. But I'm, obviously I have a little bit more self-control than the 16-year-old. So how do you help starting to develop or control the obsessive compulsive tendencies that teens have developed around phones? Because it has to be even more exacerbated now.
Yeah, and I think you have to realize initially that phone use or media use can be addictive. Like there's actual research that has been done over, last several years, where people are looking at, just from a biological, neurological, standpoint, how addictive, video games or using your phone or whatnot, and kind of the rewards you get, and then you want to get more of it, like you were saying, and it's almost like, drug use. So
yeah, the guy who invented the like button essentially made like the lab rat drinking the heroin-laced water.
Right. So when you think about it as potentially being addictive, that's not an exaggeration. Like I said, there's been research that looks at that, and we know that's an area of treatment now. People who, are just kind of like gambling or other things, they're getting treated, because of their electronic use or video game use, for sure. So you have to realize that can be, a possible problem. So you can be on the watch for it. But you're going to have, again, to put some of those limits, and maybe, teens themselves need to give, themselves some of those breaks. And again, starting small, right? If you can't put your phone away for a whole day, fine, maybe put it away for an hour and do something else. I mean, there's a lot of tools that you can use with like screen time or just putting your phone away. So maybe start practicing some of those things.
Right. It doesn't have to be, beautiful point. It doesn't have to be all day. Like if you could recognize this of yourself, if you're like a teenager, right? And you're like, okay, I really have a problem with this. Let's start with like 30 or 45 minutes where I just put it away. And as painful as that may be, I'm going to realize at the end of it, I'm okay. right? And then you work up to like an hour. And,
Right.
and then at the very least, you will recognize that you have the capacity. You have
Right.
worked up your tolerance for being away from your phone, which is a step in the right direction. And then, of course, if you're a parent, you get to argue with your kid about doing this and say, this is going to be good for you. And they're like, I hate you, Dad.
Right. But also you have to lead by example, right? Like if that's an area of difficulty at home, maybe that's a rule for everyone, right? Where, those phones, during dinner time, or, we all put our phones away at a certain time at night. That will likely help teens follow through if they're seeing you trying to do some of those things as well.
Right. That's actually one of my, I have these little bits that I go through with students. And one of the jokes is that parents always come into your room unannounced. They knock on your door as they're opening the door. They don't actually knock and wait for a response. It's just like, what's the point in knocking?
Right.
You're just going to come in, just say like, I'm here. And then they sit on your bed and just stare at you. And you're kind of like, do you need something? Like, you're just always on your phone. I just want to connect with you. And it's this annoying thing. You're like, I'm doing something. Like, I have stuff. They're like, but how's your day? It's like, oh my God, what are you doing? And that's when the parent's trying to engage the student. And the parent's always very critical of the student about like, oh, you're always on your computer. You're always on your phone. But when the student goes to talk to the parent, there's always the image of like the dad staring down at his phone, holding it at arm's length because he can't read anything. And you've given up when you increase the font on your phone. Yes. So there are only like 5 words on the screen and you're still struggling to see it. And the kid comes up and they're like, Dad, can I talk to you? He's like, what? Like annoyedly looking over his shoulder, like, I'm doing something. She's like, Dad, I know, but I need to talk to you. Like, Can you wait? Like, so again, modeling that behavior. We're so critical of young people for being attached to these phones. But again, adults do it too. That's exactly what's happening, but in reverse. And we justify it with, well, what I'm doing is important. That's right.
Yeah.
But guess what? To the teen, it's also important.
Too.
It's the same thing. But we don't.
Absolutely.
It was like, well, this pays the rent. Okay, well, this could be a group project, or this could be me having a crisis with my friend. Right? Like, it's all important.
Right.
And going through the process of explaining that, I think for adults, I read a book years ago, Zen and the Art of, I think it was sports or something. And one of the stories was about this person who had gone to visit a friend, and the friend got mail delivered, like back in the day when you used to have envelopes, and a piece of mail came that was very, very important. And he set it to the side, and the guy's like, well, look, I know you really want to open that. Like, that was that correspondence you've been waiting for. It's like, yes, and it can keep waiting. But helping younger people understand that this really important thing is happening in my life as an adult, but I'm going to prioritize you and seeing you over checking my phone, right? So sharing the burden of, we have to put down the things that we still consider important to engage in the real world. Instead of just saying, well, this actually is important.
Right.
It's like, yes, it's all important.
Yeah, and again, I mean, if you're going to have some rules, it better be rules that you think you can have for yourself as well. Otherwise, it's just easy to make up rules that, teens will see as hypocritical or, don't make any sense. So if they don't have any input or say into some of this, rule making, more likely than not, that process is not going to be successful.
A good friend of mine did a master's in psychology. I think it was at Oxford, and he did this big research project to try to identify how students responded to parents encouraging them to do schoolwork and whatnot. And what was very interesting, and of course it's one of those duh kind of things, is he realized that if whatever the parent happened to be doing had a far greater impact on how the student responded to encouragement in academics. So if the parent was the type of person who would say, hey, you need to go do your homework, and then the parent just sat on the couch, watching football or whatever, then the student was far less likely to care at all about school, right? Whereas if the parent said, hey, you need to work on school, and, read a book or engaged in some kind of work themselves instead of just entertainment and whatnot, then the student was far more likely to do that. And of course you hear that and you're like, well, of course, But in practice, it's almost like we forget it. It seems so like, duh, everybody knows that. But we don't, again, in this realm, you still see your parents glued to their phones. You still see people, posting every aspect of their life for social feedback.
Right. Again, if you're going to have to make up some of these rules, you have to examine if you yourself can keep them,
Right.
And if they make sense.
Right. And of course, I think you can use if I can't follow this rule myself, then it likely doesn't make sense.
Right. Right. If it doesn't make sense, I mean, most likely no one's going to follow it. So it just becomes like an added burden. Like you feel like you have a rule, but no one's following it, and it makes people feel frustrated. Then they move away from making any kind of, rules or boundaries or any of those things.
This is kind of a dark question, but I really feel compelled to ask it. As we started out by saying, there's acknowledgement that everyone's struggling. Okay, nobody's happy. And even people who are like in the academic world, even people who say, hey, look, I can't wait to get back to school, but I'm still going to go distance learning until this is gone, right? So everybody acknowledges they want to be back in person, and we want to get our community back to where it was. Everybody knows we have individuals suffering, and there have been some very limited reports about, suicide or attempted suicide and mass depression. But as you and I were talking about beforehand, there's really no way for people to understand how deep this problem runs. So in your experience over the last year, and especially in the last 6 months, how much of a greater crisis are we in now from a mental health standpoint, from a suicide or a suicide attempt standpoint with young people than compared before?
That's a great question. I think before I answer that, we have to realize that we're coming already, as far as mental health and with teens, from a place of deficit, unfortunately, because mental health has not been prioritized as it should, and that system was already very fragile before the pandemic even started. We don't have enough resources, we don't have enough people doing that work, it's not really getting the attention it needs, so we're already coming from a place of deficit, right? We're, like I said, those numbers have been consistently on the rise. So add to it, everything that's been going on, and it's not just the pandemic as in, health, fears or concerns. It's everything that goes with it, right? It's almost like compounded, stressors and trauma, right? For some people that may be a job loss, losing your house, losing someone, not being in school, moving, being homeless, whatever, right? So there's a number of stressors that are accumulating. And when you think about kids and teens, they're naturally resilient. But when you've got, a number of stressors, again, over a very long period of time with what it feels like no end in sight, right? That resiliency can only go so much or
plus,
so far.
I'm very sorry to interrupt, but plus we considered them resilient when they had their stress relief mechanisms in place, when they had their coping and support networks, right? They don't have that now. Like, teens are resilient when they can go to school, they can do sports, they have their close friends, they can go blow steam off on the weekends. That's when they're resilient. That's not what's happening now. So if we're coming from a deficit in mental health, when we had the best case scenario of them having their people, their social interactions, their athletics, their personal pursuits, if we were in a deficit then, what's happening now that we've taken away all of that and added turmoil within the parent unit and financial issues that, of course, they're sensitive to?
Yeah, and that creates a crisis, and that's, I think,
Right.
what we're in. It is a mental health, crisis as much as, the pandemic is a public health crisis, because when you've got people who are reporting, more depression, anxiety, suicide, drug use, not just teens, but adults too. Those ripple effects trickle to every area of life where it creates those crises, right?
It
You know,
becomes a self-reinforcing cycle.
right. We know that, people who struggle with depression or other mental health, disorders are more likely to have, like cardiovascular disease, diabetes. They, more likely to be overweight. There is more correlated with unemployment. Teens who have mental health diagnosis are twice as likely to drop out of high school than those who don't. And again, this is just in kind of quote unquote normal times. But to your point, when you add all of these stressors and take away a lot of the resources, it's no wonder we're seeing, that increase in severity of symptoms and acuity.
What is the actual increase? Like, what are we talking about?
Good question. And the interesting thing, we don't have any specific numbers. Most recent data, what I looked at is probably from 2019, 2018. We don't really have firm numbers from 2020. But I know, a lot of ERs, even in our local area have said maybe like, fall of 2020, they've probably seen maybe, twice as much suicide attempts and people coming into the ER with those concerns.
And those are the people who were not successful.
Right.
Like, those are just attempts.
Yeah, so when you think about that, I mean, that's scary. I mean, that's a lot of attempts. If completed suicides, make it to the news, it's usually just like this one story. But there's other stories, but there's endless stories of attempts. I mean, thankfully, they're failed attempts, but people don't realize the emotional impact that has when someone has made an attempt. It's not just like, whoa, you made an attempt, but now you're okay, you're safe. I mean, you have to deal with that trauma, right? And process that and work through it. Families have to deal with that, right? And even past that, they deal with the fear of, what if my child makes another attempt, right? When can I know? When can I feel they're okay? So there's a lot of, factors that go into that. So again, the impact is we don't have, firm numbers, but some people are saying it's probably likely more than doubled those, suicide attempts and people, showing up in the ERs with those concerns and being hospitalized.
Gosh, man, what a horrible thing. And then just looking at how you recover from that. It's not like you can just go on a trip to Tahoe.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's the scary part too, is when things again eventually return to normal, whenever that is or what it looks like, those things don't just automatically disappear. I mean, this will likely be, one of the last things to recover. Because it takes time and it takes work. And if we already don't have these resources, we might not even catch those things. I mean, when we talk about numbers maybe doubling, these are just people who end up in the ER. That's not, counting the people who make an attempt at home and no one knows about it.
Right.
Because they've survived it, right? And if you've never talked about it and you carry that, with you for 10 years as an adult, I mean, that effect carries over. And people think, well, this is just kind of, one sector of society or, a group of people. But not only are the numbers concerning, but it does bleed into every other factor of our society, right? When people are not functioning okay, even if they're quote unquote functional, right? They're not going to be as productive. They're not going to be, as healthy. So there's still going to be a lot of effects.
I think that would be very naive for somebody to say that this is only one section of the society, because last I checked, mental health issues are not just something in the realm of like, people under 5'2", right? Like, it affects everyone.
Absolutely. I mean, we know mental health and suicidal ideation cuts through, all socioeconomic, racial,
Yes.
Everywhere. It's certainly happening in our community. So it's not just like this, some faraway place. I mean, it's really happening everywhere.
I know you're short on time because you took time out of your workday. I appreciate that. One last question for people listening. What's one thing, or two things if you have them, that they can do? Say they have let's say they have a high schooler. what's something that they can do with a high schooler today, tonight, to check in, to reconnect, to ward this off and try to, flush anything that's kind of lingering out into the open and be addressed? What can they do?
I mean, I would say, again, going back to, beginning of our conversation, you have to find tools to ask those questions. Don't shy away from those hard questions. If people are struggling with depression or suicidal thoughts, they think they're the only ones, or there's a lot of already like pain and shame and a lot of things that surround it that, teens and kids will rarely volunteer that information unless you ask them. And again, if you're asking but you really don't want to know the answer, I mean, that's not the way to go. So I would, ask, I would say straight up ask how they're doing, but maybe not in such a kind of a vague, open-ended type of question, because you're likely to get fine, whatever, okay. But like, how are you feeling? Like, what's been stressing you lately? Or, what's an area of struggle right now? Or what's an area where you feel like you just can't cope with anymore? Asking those questions, and if you start that conversation, maybe slowly and gradually make your way into, do you ever have any thoughts about, if it'd just be easier to not be around?
Yeah.
So if you kind of phrase it that way, maybe you can start getting some of those answers versus like, are you thinking about killing yourself? Which no one will say, yeah,
right.
sure.
Right.
So just asking, from like how, I guess, hopeless you're starting to feel, which again, unfortunately, a lot of teens are feeling that way. Because like you said, there's, some of these resources are not there, whether it's the social outlet, the school, the sports, you name it.
Right, for sure. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you
for
for
sharing
having
this
me.
information. I'm really happy that we got a chance to talk, because I think the things we're seeing in our community, both with the adults and the younger people, are very much a product of people struggling with mental health, and really coming to the end of their coping mechanisms, and coming to the end or just being overwhelmed with anxiety about so many things. And I think the more we can get this out in the open, find friends, connect with people, really flush out the things that are lingering with people, or harassing people and just bothering them. Hopefully we can avoid the worst and get back to the other side of it.
Yes.
So thank you again for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.